Hey, good day, folks. It's Leon again with Lost Creek Wholesale. Matt and I are here again, and we have another exciting guest interview today. We're happy to have Aaron Steele here with us. He is the owner of Goats on the Go, as well as the voice of the Farm Dog podcast. I first was introduced to Aaron through his podcast. Um, he has some very interesting episodes out there about border collies, livestock guardian dogs, all kinds of herding breeds. And then as I had interest in the solar grazing industry, at some point I came across this Goats on the Go company. And anyway, we're excited to have him on today. Welcome, Aaron.
Hey, thank you. I'm pleased to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
So we're hoping that Aaron can tell us a bit about his farm dog podcast as well as Goats on the Go. So take it away, Aaron. What happened first? The goats or
What
the
happened
dogs?
first? The goats happened first. Boy, the goats happened to me. Yeah, in 2012, we live in just a near Ames, Iowa, in central Iowa, just a small acreage, and we were looking for something to make it feel a little bit more like a farm. My wife grew up on a farm. I grew up kind of a generation removed from the family farm, but have great memories of going to visit the family farm and stay with my grandparents and my aunt and uncle and do chores and feed bottle calves and that sort of thing. But so we had this little acreage, and we just wanted to pretend that it was a farm. So we got a handful of goats to eat the extra land that we didn't want to mow, and um, kind of fell in love with meat goats. We had a bad drought that first summer in 2012 when we got them, and so we had these horrible weed patches. In fact, we tried to plant like a wildlife food plot, and it was a disaster. So when we started running out of grass for the goats to eat, we tossed them into that weed patch, having heard that goats can eat weeds and brush. And so out of desperation, somewhat, we threw them in there. We were amazed at what they could do. They were super entertaining, first of all, but then the way they just attacked weeds, stuff you would never consider to be forage for another animal. We're just amazed by that. And this farmer gene started being awakened in me. And I started thinking, how could we have an actual farm, like a profitable farm, not just a hobby farm, without going and buying lots of $12,000 an acre land here in central Iowa, and without tons of capital and machinery and that sort of thing. And so we started looking into the idea of using goats as a service to manage weeds and brush for customers. I don't remember the details exactly, but there must have been some businesses up and running already for me to even have had the confidence to plow forward with it. But there were not much of a presence here in the Midwest. And so almost on a whim, as something to pour some creative energy into, I called up another family, hobby farm family that I knew, and I said, "Hey, you want to partner in this? Let's give this a go." And they thought it sounded like fun, so we went ahead and did that. And lo and behold, we were bowled over by the demand, and it really helped us grow our goat herd much faster than we would have been able to do otherwise. And to this day, the business just continues to grow in a variety of ways. And so it's been a fantastic ride. We've loved every minute of it. We've produced some really good goat meat for people, and I think the future is exciting for us too. So that's goats on the go.
So you're offering forage management services with your goats on the go, is that correct?
Well, in a roundabout way, when you say
Okay.
forage management services, that makes you think of farmers. We're helping farmers and ranchers manage their forage, and
Yeah.
uh, that's not so much the case. In fact, one of the mistakes we made early on is we thought that we would be doing a lot of pasture management and improvement work for farmers. We'd go in and hit the weeds and brush, make more space for your cattle, more space for grass and clover and stuff to grow, and we'd be out of there. And it turns out that was kind of a non-starter for uh, those farmers. it's just hard for farmers to get their heads around the idea of paying somebody else to put animals on their land, right?
Yeah, yeah,
So
Yeah,
we
I
put,
can identify with that. I think that'd be really hard for me to
yeah.
do.
yeah, you don't know how many in those early days, you don't know how many farmers we talked to who said, well, I'll just get my own goats. And, inside we're like, I kind of understand where you're coming from. I also know that you're never going to get goats and you're never going to fix your fence to contain goats and you're never going to want to deal with all the challenges of goats, but I understand, So instead we pivoted to a different type of customer base that is much more suburban. We do a lot of suburban and urban parks as well as county parks and conservation areas. We do work for big conservation groups, both public and private, mostly fighting invasive species, which many of the brush problems we're dealing with here, well, really all over the country, are invasive plants. Some of our customers identify those as invasive plants and they want to hire us to promote native landscapes. But many of our customers also are just annoyed by the vegetation and they want it gone and they would never know to call it invasive. And so they hire us as a natural way to deal with those vegetation challenges. So there is like an service provider agriculture separation here where we go and provide the service to one type of customer, but we're using that in parallel with our own agricultural operation to produce sheep and goats.
Mhm. So more of a brush management, invasive species management that you're doing there.
Yeah, correct. Because brush is, in many people's view, a big problem. To us, it's a hugely underutilized resource, a completely different forage base that people are willing to pay us to eat. So that's what excites us about the business in parallel with a meat goat operation.
So in your area there, what's your biggest forage / brush that you're targeting?
We get hired to graze a lot of honeysuckle, multiflora rose, um, mulberry, basically any woody brush species in. We're probably dealing with a lot of the same stuff you guys are there. Any woody brush species that annoys people is perfect goat food for us. And a lot of our invasive species are just coincidentally woody brush species that are ideal for goats.
Do you have a lot of autumn olive there in your area?
Yeah, it depends on the part of the state. Southern Iowa and Eastern Iowa have a lot of autumn olive, and that's another fantastic one for goats. There's several different viney species too that climb up and kill native trees, and we're called to deal with those often as well.
Any poison ivy calls?
Oh yeah, yeah, that's a common one for us.
Interesting.
Yeah, poison ivy is not actually invasive or non-native here where we're located, but the goats do eat the poison ivy, and that makes many of our customers very happy.
Interesting. I live real close to a pretty big tract of wildlife preserve and preserve and refuge. And they use some goats from down toward Pittsburgh some to come up, and especially around trail areas where there's a lot of foot traffic on some of those trails. And there's a lot of poison ivy right along the edge, they will fence it in and put just like a couple goats, like it might be 6 or 8 head at a time.
Sure. Okay. Yep.
Just to
Well, we
hammer out
take
that.
yeah, we take a slightly different approach where we try to mob graze the vegetation. We want to get into the project, pound it with goats, but keep the goats moving frequently into different paddocks until all of the contracted vegetation has been eaten, and then we get out. So yeah, but same basic concept.
So I don't know if you have where you want to go with this conversation, Aaron, but I got like a lot of questions that are starting to pop up. So
Yeah, bring them on. Fire away.
what fencing? What are you doing for fencing?
We use for the goats on these targeted grazing projects, we're generally using portable electric fencing. The netting, that you get from any number of retailers. That works pretty well. You know, everybody who has dealt with that probably has a love-hate relationship with it. I'm more on the love side, but I have my days. You know, it is a challenge, but it's what makes our business possible.
Mhm.
We're also experimenting with virtual fencing, GPS enabled virtual fencing, where it's kind of new to us. So we're still learning the ropes on that. But that has been fascinating to experiment with. And we do see some really good applications for our projects for customers as well.
I just have to wonder how that virtual fencing works in like a very urban area. Like,
What has been your experience with that virtual fencing so far? Like, does it work well to move them with that? Or is it, I guess I was seeing it more as, once they get used to their area kinda, they do pretty well with staying there anyway. But you can take them 5 miles from the place they were, 10 miles, whatever, it doesn't matter. Load them up on a trailer, dump them out, and set the for the virtual fence and have pretty good success with it.
Yeah, I guess my overall opinion about it, based on my experience so far, is that it is definitely the future. You know, there's a few bugs to be worked out yet, and it requires a bit of a mindset change. Uh, you can't think of it like hard fencing around a boundary of a property. But if you can change that mindset, it and we can get a few of those last glitches worked out in the technology, it's going to take over. We're all going to be using it in less than 10 years, and I think it's super exciting. You can move the animals with it quite effectively, and they they adapt very quickly. They get tuned into the sounds that the collars make and the patterns of those sounds that the collars make and the pitches that those collars make, and they become old hats at it. Now, some of them learn way faster than others. Some of them want to test the limits all the time. And so they burn out their batteries a little faster than others. But generally, there's some things that prevent me from using them in all applications. And you mentioned urban places, for example. Those properties are usually too small and too delicate, and the hazards are too great. The risks are too great if they do get out to rely on those collars entirely. But there's other locations where it's completely ideal, and it allows you so much greater management opportunity over the animals. We can graze one little spot over here for an hour, but not let them have too much impact on it because it's a little thin, and then move them on into like some lowland where we have much denser forage and let them be there for 2 days, and then move them all on again, all from your couch using your cell phone. Just the prospect of that is pretty amazing. So yeah, it's exciting stuff.
so I'm just thinking from a cattle guy's perspective, you could move a line on your map, so to speak, 3 times a day and give the cows another 100 foot of fresh grass.
Absolutely. And that's the exciting part, is that, why only once a day or twice a day or 3 times a day? Why not every 2 hours? And why not make each move customized for the next piece of land they're on? And for that matter, why have it be square? Why have it be rectangular? It doesn't have to be. So yeah, there's a lot of benefits, and I think that we're just figuring out how to use it best right now. And there are some limitations to the technology, and it's not going to completely eliminate physical fences or electric fences. But I think that's one of the most exciting things, is how are we going to use the technology we already have, old school technology like woven wire and barbed wire, in combination with the virtual collars.
The idea of using it as a rotational grazing tool is really exciting to me, because the main reason I don't do really intense rotational grazing is I don't want to be out there, even once a day moving fences. I'm too lazy for that. But if I can preset it, or just do it from my phone where it moves them every day or a couple times a day, man, from a forage standpoint, that would be awesome.
Right. And once you eliminate labor, I mean, that's your first instinct, right? Is how much easier would that be for me if I could do that, if I could just move them from my couch, or if I could go stand at the fence line just to watch and make sure everything's okay, and then move them without stringing out any more polywire. So that's your first instinct. But after you use it a little bit, you're thrilled with the labor savings, but then you start thinking about all the things I could be doing with this now. You know, all the new doors it opens up to you.
Yep. What's the cost like? Is it for
Yeah.
I mean, something I've heard is that it's probably not going to be, for most of the sheep and goat producers, it's not going to be cost effective right away, just with the sheer number of collars we need. Now, obviously with your grazing you do, I could see that quicker in your setup than on the average farmer's setup. But what's that look like?
Yeah, so the brand that we've been working with, I believe they're in the neighborhood of $240 per unit. And then you've got another $30 of service plan on top of that, because the collar communicates with GPS satellites to create the boundary. But in order to communicate with you, it has to have a cellular plan attached to it. So it is expensive. Remember, I mentioned there's some glitches. There's some things that need to be worked out yet, and that's one of them. I have a couple of different sources of revenue for my sheep and goats, so that makes it a little more cost effective for me. Even so, I don't know that I can outfit all my animals with it until that price starts to drop. But of course, the history of consumer electronics is that prices drop over time, and I think we'll get there eventually. You're right, though, that just the numbers of sheep and goats that you're dealing with relative to the cost is pretty rough. It can be much more efficient with cattle. The cattle collars are only a little more expensive, but you're putting one on a much larger animal, and fewer of them.
So that service fee of $30 a year is per collar.
That's correct. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. So that ends up being just as much of a financial challenge or more than the original outlay for the units themselves.
You're like buying two goats.
Yeah.
Basically. I mean, you buy the goat and then you buy another goat for the collar.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yep, exactly. And so that's the biggest obstacle right now. I expect that to drop. And honestly, I've gone back and forth on it. We were part of a pilot project with the company. Then we had the opportunity to buy our collars that we were using as part of the pilot project. And I had to, sit down and do some real thinking about whether that was worthwhile. And every time I was about to say, no, it's too expensive, I thought back to last summer where I moved goats around a property all summer long that had a creek running through it, and I did nothing, except change batteries. And so that's ultimately what swayed me to buy all those collars, and I'll be watching closely to see those prices start to drop.
Sure. Yep. That's interesting. Super interesting.
So you created a franchise. What do you call this, Goats on the Go?
Sure.
Can you talk about that?
Our network.
Your network.
Yeah. Yep. We're not technically a franchise. After a few years of seeing really strong demand almost all over the Midwest for a goat grazing service, and also having lots of people contact us and saying, hey, I'd like to start a business like yours. How do I do that? What advice do you have for me? We decided that we would build out a network of, we call them affiliates. And they are independently owned businesses that operate under our brand and get access to our training and a bunch of resources and support to provide their own goat grazing service right where they live. And one of the challenges with this business is that it's hard to just do more. It's hard to grow by just doing more acres, more goats, more customers, because you start to get into some pretty heavy logistical and transportation challenges as you go farther and farther out. And so I think one of the benefits of our network is that we're helping these goat grazing businesses get started right where they live, serving the neighbors and communities and people around them locally, rather than putting more goats and more employees all over the country, or having a giant caravan of semis and RVs going from one project to the next. So that's our affiliate network. There are about 65 affiliate territories all across the U.S., from California to Connecticut and Florida and all over Texas. So all of those little companies just pay us an annual flat fee to be a member of the club and get access to our benefits and resources as they provide that service locally.
And all that information can be found on your website, I reckon.
You bet. goatsonthego.com, and you can just click own a business at the top and find out all about it.
Very good.
Sounds interesting.
We'll put a link to that in the show notes there whenever we wrap this up. So anything else you want to talk about for Goats on the Go?
Well, I will mention, you actually brought it up earlier, the topic of solar grazing, which we see as a huge opportunity in the U.S. And has caused us to double down on the growth of our sheep flock. Solar grazing is just maintaining the vegetation under these large solar farms, under the solar panels, with grazing rather than mowing. And sheep turn out to be the ideal animal for that currently, and goats kind of already have a bad reputation for climbing on panels and chewing on cables and that sort of thing. So the solar industry is just growing by leaps and bounds, and maintaining the vegetation under those panels and producing food in a regenerative way, while also producing renewable energy. That's a really potent mix. And some solar companies out there have bought into that mix and are hiring grazing professionals to manage that vegetation with sheep. So we're trying to grow that at the same time. We apply a different brand to that, Sheep on the Go. You might not be surprised to learn. So between Goats on the Go and Sheep on the Go, we have this network of professionals all across the country that is really good at making their customers look good, really good at doing the farm work, but then talking to the people in the boardroom also, and being able to bridge that gap. And they're really good and skilled at managed grazing and doing it in a mobile, portable sort of way.
Interesting. So with these goats, where does your kidding happen? How does that all tie into the picture?
Yeah, each of our affiliates does it a little bit differently. I can tell you how I do it, and it's evolved over the years. We started out just by kidding around mid-April on pasture here at home, and then gathering up all those kids and does and taking them to go do our projects. And that had some real benefits in that, those kids, every generation, our herd became better brush eaters, better targeted grazing animals. But the kids are also a real hassle to manage on those projects. And you've got a new set of hazards on those projects than you would have at home. So we went through a phase where we were just trying to meet demand by keeping our wethers through the winter and through an entire grazing season again, and then selling them when they were quite a bit larger at the end of that second year, simply to have enough animals, especially unattached animals with no kids at their sides, to go out and do those projects. Currently, we're experimenting with an early weaning and just keeping the kids home and using a combination of pasture and some additional grain feeding, and just get them separated early on and get those does out there working. And I'm pretty optimistic about that approach. I think we'll be doing more of that.
So are you still kidding in April then, or did you move that forward?
We are still kidding in April. We want to kid outside with as little support as possible. And we just can't, I think it's just asking too much to push that back into March, here, where we're located here in Iowa. I just don't think we'd have much success with that. So we're kidding right now as we're recording this, and we try to leave the does and kids alone and have them make it on their own and produce 2 kids each and do it without taking any time away from me.
So,
Go,
so
go,
you
that's-
still
go ahead,
you
Matt.
still focus on the production part pretty heavily from what I'm hearing you say, as far as the amount of pounds of goats you produce off a per doe. That's still a pretty big part of your operation, is to actually produce kids.
Yeah, absolutely. This could take us down a bit of a rabbit hole, but as our affiliate network has grown across the US, my job is more and more managing that network and managing our brand as a company and recruiting new affiliates. And so I do less and less of the actual on the ground work each year. So I've had the luxury now of being able to shrink my herd a little bit, be really selective, and just use my herd as a learning lab for the most part. So I am, keeping lots of records and culling really hard. And the problem with that, or the challenge with that with goats, is there's so many factors you could cull for that worrying about, at least in my operation, measuring the total weaning weight relative to the weight of the doe is like fixing the plumbing when the house is on fire. So I've got other things that are higher priority. So if that doe can kid with no trouble on her own, takes no assistance, she can do it on pasture, she can have twins every year, and she's a good mother, and she can raise those twins to weaning, that's about all I'm asking right now. And she can do all that without having ridiculous hoof growth and without having parasite troubles. That's enough for me. We're going to get to a point, I hope, where we're actually looking at how quickly those kids grew, what their average daily gain was, but those are a little bit further down the priority list for us right now.
Sure, makes sense. But you're still producing a product. I see some of these guys that are doing targeted grazing. After a while, they just decide that their business is in the targeted grazing thing, so they might even just use wethers just year after year to keep grazing and not bother with the kidding, or very minimal.
Sure. Yeah, I see that happening too. And like I said, we've experimented with keeping wethers, till they're 2 years old, just because the demand was so high for the targeted grazing business. But ultimately, we sold them for meat because that's why we got into this in the first place. We wanted to produce really great food for people. So we are producing kids for market. We are trying to get better at it every year and trying not to lose sight of that goal. That's not to say that we have 65 affiliates all across the country. Some of them just want to raise goats. They just want to have goats for their hobby farm, and their goats on the go business is a way to pay those expenses. So not all of them raise goats for meat, but I wouldn't want to do it any other way. I don't want to lose sight of that. I think that the two things work together really well. We found out early on that we thought the targeted grazing would be like the sideline thing that brought in a little extra revenue, and that selling meat goats would be the profitable thing. It actually turns out to be the reverse. We are more profitable with the targeted grazing operation, but it hasn't changed. That hasn't changed what we set out to do. There are some points where your management decisions, what would be best for the meat goat operation, kind of conflicts with what would be best for the targeted grazing operation. Then you got to make some choices. But yeah, we're here to be in agriculture.
Sure.
I mean, if you're not gonna select for an animal that performs, I mean, the whole idea doesn't look sustainable ultimately. And you know
Yeah,
that 2-year-old wether, really, that's still a pretty marketable animal, I would think.
well, absolutely. So it kind of makes sense if you can carry that weather through the winter, through one winter, and then every pound of gain that they put on after that, you were paid to put on.
Hmm.
That's a pretty good deal.
Yep.
So there are several different approaches you can take to incorporate a targeted grazing operation, and it just has to fit what your goals are and what you want to do on your farm.
Yeah. So can you talk a little bit about what these goats, what breed? Are they a composite? I have some ideas of what they probably are, but yeah,
Yeah.
tell me about the goat itself. This call is sponsored by Lost Creek Wholesale, your universal feeder distributor in US and Canada. Looking for a way to supplement your livestock with ease? Consider a saliva lick feeder. Universal Feeders saliva lick feeders offer the ability to restrict livestock's intake to a preset amount, determined by the adjustment bar depth and width on the feeder. By narrowing the width and depth of the feed in the groove, this gives us the ability to limit the amount of feed that will stick to a sheep, goat, or cow's tongue. Using Universal Feeder's patent-pending easy adjustment system and saliva lick feature, we can limit sheep and goats to less than 1 pound per head per day and cattle to approximately 6 pounds per head per day. We also offer creep gate attachments for both small lambs and kids. Visit our website at www.lostcreekwholesale.com to find a dealer near you or give us a call at 717-310-3641.
Yeah, when our original stock came mostly from a ranch that had a composite, largely Kiko, but there was some Spanish. They'd tried just about everything over the years. So there's some Spanish and some Boer and even some myotonic in there. And since then, we have bred to high percentage or 100% Kiko bucks. So after all these generations, we're basically at 100% or close Kiko does. So that's our focus. We've really liked the Kiko as a breed. Mothering ability is just better than we've seen with any other breed overall, broadly. And yeah,
They're tough little beggars, aren't they?
They are.
Kikos.
Yeah, everybody with goats has to worry about predators, but man, it would take a pretty desperate coyote, to take on some of our does. They're very defensive of their kids and pretty tough. So in that sense, they're pretty tough. But as you guys probably know, goats are kind of a enigma in that they're super tough in some ways and super delicate in others, and therein lies the challenge.
Yeah. What about parasite resistance? How is that part of your selection, I'm guessing, and how big of an issue is that for you with the way you're rotating? It might not be as bad as for some farms, but that's something that especially around here where we're at in eastern Pennsylvania, there's been a lot of guys get into goats in the last couple years here, and those are more high percentage boar goats, and they have the philosophy you don't leave them out the barn door, they're going to die from parasites, which they're probably partially true being they have boar goats. but but yeah,
Yeah.
I'd be interested in what your experiences were with the parasite challenges and so forth.
Yeah, well, my opinion is if you don't have a goat that you can let out the barn door for fear of it dying, then you're missing a giant advantage,
Yep.
a totally unfair advantage of raising goats. And so we do have this big benefit though that our goats are out eating on customers' properties. So it's like the ultimate pasture rotation, right?
It's like a clean plate every day. I mean,
Clean plate every day. Yeah. And on top of that, they're typically eating up high. We're not asking them to eat a 12-inch high grass pasture. We're asking them to eat the thing they would like more than anything else, which is woody brush. They always start in a new spot with their heads and their eyes up in the air, and that's where they start eating. So we have fewer issues with parasites than most people would. We do call pretty hard for that, though. There's a couple of situations in which a goat might get a freebie deworming, but not very many. And if she needs it, she's probably not going to stay around for very long. So, yeah, we call hard, but we also have that huge advantage of being able to eat the right stuff all the time. We don't have to take advantage of every square foot of vegetation. We can just target the woody brush that they prefer anyway.
So when you're out on a site, water, mineral, probably no feed supplement. How does that all work out?
No, so if you've ever looked at what the nutritional content of multiflora rose and honeysuckle and poison ivy is, you would be astonished. It's just that nothing eats it except goats, so we don't think much about it. But like poison ivy can have 24% crude protein at some points in its stages of development, and honeysuckle's like 14%. Multiflora rose is 16%. I may have those numbers off just a little bit, but it's really, really good feed. And so if given the opportunity to eat that all summer long, our goats come back in the fall looking terrific, and we don't supplement them at all other than some very basic mineral and water.
Yeah. Because your mineral needs are probably not very high, even in being out in that kind of a diverse species, where they're getting fresh pickings every day, and it's a pretty diverse picking. So your mineral needs are probably mostly met just with the forages they're getting. Is that?
Yeah, that's absolutely true. They'll stop eating mineral about a quarter of the way into the summer. And I think that's partly because of the diversity of vegetation they have access to. I hesitate to say this on a recording, but I am a mineral skeptic. And so I'm not spending a lot of money on mineral for my goats. I always have mineral available, but you would not be impressed by what I feed them. The opportunity
he must have listened to our episode, Matt.
Oh, now I have to go back and listen to that one.
Yeah.
I'm just surprised at how many people will collect data and analyze everything and need research support for every single thing they do except mineral. They take on faith that they need the most expensive mineral mix they can find. Now you can prove me wrong by showing me the science and showing me the data and showing me the research, and I'll hop on the mineral train so fast you won't believe it. It's just that it's not out there. That there's not a ton of research support for it. We've had the opportunity over the years to do a postmortem on some of our does, and do tissue samples of livers and that sort of thing, and we ended up not being deficient in anything, with very little mineral supplementation.
Yeah.
Some of those woody plants, some of those almost trees have their root system and stuff probably goes down deeper than the average forage that somebody is planting. They're going to be bringing up stuff that, I'm just going to say orchard grass or whatever, probably can't even get to. I could be wrong, and then when you have all that diversity, different plants are pulling different things. When we get into a monoculture setting, and monoculture could be a pasture where you have almost one species in there, not clover, you don't have many legumes and that kind of stuff, you're gonna probably need more supplementation quicker than when you're just.
To me, that's what it's all about. If you need it, if you're deficient in something, which is typically when you're on a more of a monoculture feed, or grazing, whatever, then minerals can pay. But if you're out in a diverse species like you're talking, you shouldn't need many, if any, minerals.
Unless you have
So
extremely depleted soil or something.
it could be in a certain area, if you're grazing strip mines or something, where it might be, a certain mineral that you really need. But it doesn't have to be the most expensive. It needs to be the right one. I think that's what a lot of people forget. It's just, oh, well, this guy told me this mineral is gonna do so and so for me. Well, why? Is there something in there you need? That
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And we may just be lucky. I mean, we just may not have deficiencies in the soil around here. We do get to graze a huge diversity of vegetation. Goats, I'm just shooting from the hip here, but goats eat not only leaves, but the branch tips. They strip bark. They eat berries. They eat just about every part of a plant that is soft enough for them to eat. That may contribute to it too. So yeah, that's just a really long way around to say we just don't have too many problems with mineral deficiencies, even copper, which of course is, what most people pour into their goats like crazy.
I'm guessing you have a way to provide water. How does that work? Are you trucking it to them? How's that work?
Yeah, we're mostly delivering it to these sites. When we've got 40 goats on 2 or 3 different 1 acre sites, we're not burning through the water very fast, especially with goats, and especially if we're in a normal year moisture wise where there's plenty of moisture in the vegetation. So we can roll up with a pickup with a 60-gallon tank in the back and just gravity feed water down into a drinking tub for the goats. Sometimes you got to get pretty creative about how to get it from the curb of a suburban cul-de-sac to the backyard without ruining anybody's lawn. But we manage okay. So it's really not that challenging. And we will use surface water if it's available, if we've got a decent creek running through a property. Definitely. We run into challenges with larger projects that are farther away from access points. And, then we're using a four-wheeler and ATV trailer and a variety of things, and sometimes just grunting it to get the water where we need it.
So do you have any stories where like the goats got loose in the neighborhood or anything like that? Does that happen?
So, we talked about
They ate the
our
lady's rose bush or something crazy.
right. Yeah, I mean, it's happened. We haven't had the crazy ones like you see on social media. Every time I see that there's the goats loose in Boise, Idaho suburban area or something like that, I panic a little bit, and then I realize it was not one of our providers. And then I find out that really nobody found that to be very problematic at all, and it increased our website traffic and social media traffic like crazy. So, but that is one of the challenges of the business and one of the risks of the business. You certainly can't cut corners on fencing and energizers and that sort of thing, because eventually the public is going to decide that's not so cute.
Yeah.
If it eats their own rose bush, that's all it takes.
That's right.
Most people might be pretty okay with it until it eats their own rose bush. Yep.
Exactly.
What I was just thinking, what advice would you have for somebody that's looking to start out in targeted grazing? Obviously affiliate with you guys, or if somebody's just looking to start out, how do they go about that? Finding customers that are interested, or how did that work for you? I guess a little more on the getting that initial start.
Yeah. So when we started the business, I mean, one of the things that was attractive to us about it is that the few operators that were out there were, they're kind of in it, they're kind of out of it. It's hard to get a hold of them. They viewed the business as, I'm just going to roll up and drop off a bunch of goats on your property, call me when they're done, And so I tell people, sure, I'd love for you to be part of the Goats on the Go network, and we'll give you some amazing training and support, and we'll train you to be a professional. But you don't need our training to be a professional. I think the worst thing that can happen for my business is if a lot of people don't approach it professionally. don't acquire the expertise that you need. View it as a free way to feed their goats. That's a bad recipe. No, pardon me. Now, when we got started, there's I can't lie. I mean, it was attractive. The idea of
Yeah.
somebody paying me to feed my goats. I mean, that
Yep.
sounds pretty good, right? But it's definitely a side benefit. And what you learn really fast is that there's a lot of risks involved. There's a lot of effort involved, and customers pay us to do this. Because they love the idea of having goats in their backyard, but that's not enough. They also want the management and support and the assurance of knowing you're going to be there with the expertise that's necessary to support them while you're doing their project. So that's my advice to people is you don't have to get the expertise from me, but go out and get expertise. When I started, you kind of had to do it trial by error. You don't necessarily have to do that anymore. There's enough examples out there in the marketplace of professionals doing it well. So yeah, those are my thoughts. As far as acquiring customers, that's the two questions everybody wants to ask right away is, what can I charge a customer for this? And how do I find the customers who will pay that? And so they are the two toughest questions. You don't have to go much past an introductory marketing course to learn that you really need to understand customers to serve them well, because they're only halfway after, I want this vegetation problem fixed. If that was all they were concerned about, they would have done it 5 years ago with a skid loader and a brush cutter. They want something more than that, and to understand what their real problem is kind of the secret sauce of identifying and finding customers.
You probably get a lot of repeat customers. Like you go back again in 2 years and cover the same ground again.
Yep, we have customers who will have us come back repeatedly. If we kind of recommend to most people that they think of goat grazing as just another tool in the toolbox, and they don't need to dump out all the other tools. Herbicide probably plays a role, but maybe we can use it much more judiciously. If we run the goats through first, we can target that herbicide instead of spraying the whole 5 acres with it or whatever.
Sure.
But if a customer wants us to use goats and only goats, we're going to work with them on like 3 or 4 grazings over the course of 2 years, and they need to be well timed in order to kill the vegetation with goats and only goats. If they're not that committed to that kind of conservation perspective of absolutely no herbicide, absolutely no machinery, then we talk to them about using the goats as like a tool to make the first pass and turn a jungle into something that's much more manageable, much more pleasant place to be. And that allows the customer to either do follow-up work on their own, or many of our customers just say, you know what, that's amazing. When it doesn't look amazing anymore, I'll call you back.
Well, and I was gonna ask a little more on that. I think you answered my question pretty good. But like, so different species probably you would be targeting different. Like some species you might need to hit every year for a couple years till you see a big reduction. Is that
Correct. So
correct?
mature woody brush, we're going to try to stress it out to the point where it just can't recover from the winter anymore. And but with an annual or a biennial like garlic mustard or wild parsnip. Do you guys have wild parsnip out your way?
I don't think so.
Oh,
Or
good.
if we do, I don't know what it is.
Wild parsnip is
I think we do. I think I call it something different though.
okay. All right. It's bunches of yellow flowers that kind of look like little umbrellas of yellow flowers, and it's nasty stuff. It will cause blistering and scarring. It makes poison ivy look like a walk in the park. But those plants, they're dropping seed every year. That's how they're reproducing. And so if we can go in there and graze it off before seed set or while it's flowering, then we have a whole year's worth of seed that doesn't make it to the soil. Now you still got last year's seed and the year before that and the year before that, and that seed can remain viable in the soil for a long time. So, but we can make fast progress on it if we just come back and hit it real quick every year for a couple of years in a row, or a few years in a row.
How about I think Leon, you had mentioned that autumn olive. I think that's something that can kind of take over. This is going to, again, kind of pasture settings, or multiflora roses. I think I know is a issue in maybe not so much our area, but definitely in PA. Can you get much traction on some of those as far as actually reducing them? And again, I'm thinking in a pasture setting for a cattle guy. I know you said you didn't really do any of, or at least initially starting out, you didn't really do much of that. But can you make gains maybe for the guy that has cattle and is thinking of adding sheep in,
Sure.
or goats? Sorry.
Yeah. So I'm gonna tell you something that's kind of counterproductive for my business here, which is that if you are running cattle on pasture, or sheep on pasture for that matter, and you have a brush problem, you really should just get goats yourself. Now, I know there's all sorts of challenges related to that, but the constant exposure of goats on brush will kill it pretty quickly and will produce a bunch more forage for your cattle. And it will do it without any herbicide, so you're gonna maintain the diversity in your forage base. You're gonna maintain that clover and those forbs along the way. So there's not a ton of really good research out there, but there are a few case studies. One in which the organization that was managing this property actually chose to try to maintain multiflora rose as a forage for its goats, and so they very carefully rotated the goats on and off the multiflora rose. And what they found is even with really careful management, they were reducing the multiflora rose by something like 10% every year, even trying to maintain it as a forage. So brush actually does respond pretty well to exposure to goats and exposure to grazing. Some of the hair sheep breeds, by the way, they'll do a pretty good job on some of that stuff, but they just don't eat it quite as aggressively. They don't get up on their hind legs to eat it. They'll nibble at it, and there's a lot of crossover between sheep and goats on some of that vegetation, but goats are the best hardcore brush eaters.
Yeah, I have Katahdins, Matt does too, but Katahdin hair sheep. And they will hit multiflora and autumn olive very hard, but they only go up about as high as they can reach. I will see them on their stand up every now and then on their back legs, but not very often. But I have a few in my pasture, and they're stripped up as high as they can reach. It's like a green umbrella on top, kind of.
If someone's looking to run them with cattle, they're also going to compete more for the cattle feed than
the sheep will.
As well. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Definitely.
Right.
Yep.
Yeah.
Right. Yep. Yeah. I often tell people that, if you're thinking about getting goats, you should scale your goats to your vegetation problem and think of them as a tool first and a product second. The greatest value, it's hard to raise goats. It's hard to get a pound of goat meat to market. And, but if you think of it in the reverse, which is, I'm going to go buy this tool, which appreciates in value, even if I have bad kid production or bad kid survival one year, it would have to be a really awful year for you not to have a net increase in the number of goats you have out on that pasture in year 2, in year 3, in year 4. So how many tools can you go buy that actually appreciate in value as you use them? Yep. And make it so that you don't have to spend money on herbicide. You don't have to spend time on a tractor applying the herbicide. You get to maintain your clover and your forbs and your forage base. And if you're lucky, you've got some goats to get to market, and that returns some revenue as well. So if you think about goats in that way, that it's a tool first and a product second, I think that farmers and ranchers can start to consider the challenges as something that they can handle, the challenges of fencing and all the hassles that goats create.
Boy, if I'm not careful, I'm going to have a valid excuse to go get goats next.
Sorry, I'm sorry.
I I have gone down that path, Lynn, but
Yeah.
I lasted about 2 years, and then it wasn't that I didn't like the goats. It was just I got tired of managing both species, goats and sheep, and I decided it's yeah for my farm, and we don't have a ton of brush or really any brush, so um, we just got them to kind of clean up some weedier areas, and they did well with that. So yeah, yeah, definitely
Right.
seemed like a good management tool.
Yep, definitely want to scale the goats to your problem. And if you don't have a problem, I don't think that I would add to it, by adding goats. We have Katahdin sheep too, and I spend less time on 200 head of Katahdin ewes than I spend on 80 goats.
Hmm,
Absolutely, it's not close.
hmm.
That's
Interesting.
interesting.
Yeah.
Well, Aaron, do you want to tell us a little bit about the Farm Dog
I'd love
podcast
to,
yet?
yeah, I'd love to tell you about Farm Dog. I mentioned that we have this affiliate network, and we were searching for a way to try to reach more people who already had sheep and goat experience. And at the same time, I was starting to get into livestock guardian dogs and my first herding dogs. And so I just decided to start this podcast as a way to find more of those people. And so Farm Dog is just a podcast about the working dogs of farming and ranching. And we really do try to focus on the working part of it. Occasionally, we'll just talk about, good old Roy, the farm dog, but we tend to focus on dogs that have jobs and help us make a living from the land. So herding dogs or stock dogs, cow dogs, livestock guardian dogs are frequent topics. We get into terriers for pest control and even hunting dogs sometimes, because I think that the leisure side of living a rural life is part of living a rich life attached to the land too. So we'll talk about hunting dogs, and that's just been a blast. It's fun to talk to experts, people who have way more experience and expertise than I do, and to talk about breeds I've never heard of before, and learn about where they came from and what their benefits are and how they compare to other breeds that I already know. So that's been a blast, and I appreciate you guys listening to it, because it's fun to know that there's an audience out there that shares my interest, and so it's a fun little club.
Very good.
Yeah, that is to me is a very interesting topic, the working dogs. Um, as we've seen the sheep and goat industry expand in our area, there's more and more interest in using dogs, whether as guard dogs or typically most people are using border collies as herding dogs. There's a ton of interest in that, and there's not that much information available in that. A lot of what is with the border collies is the trowel people, which nothing against them, they do a really good job of maintaining the border collie breed and those working instincts, but at the same time it's still different than the average Joe Schmo that just wants a dog to help move his sheep. It's a different purpose and language. So it's I've listened to some of your podcasts. I'll have to go to listen to some more of them, but I find that really interesting. Um, on that, yeah,
Yeah, I could make every interview a an episode about trialing and professional trainers who train border collies for a game. And that game is really cool, so I don't want to sound like I'm disparaging it, but we do try to keep the focus on farm and ranch work as best we can, just because that's my particular interest. There's inevitable crossover, but what's interesting to find is that some of the best trainers in the country they demand they demand greater excellence on the farm or ranch than they demand at the trial,
yeah,
and that's why they're so good at the trial.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. What how do you use dogs in your operation again? You have, like, if you're out there doing targeted grazing, do you have guard dogs with them, or
Tip,
typically?
typically, we do not put guardian dogs out on our paying customers' projects. We're not there long enough. Often, we're in and out before any predator figures things out and gets bold enough to do anything. Plus, guardian dogs, ours are, they're not aggressive toward people at all. They're just big teddy bears for the most part. Uh, and yet they are big and they have a serious bark, and they will look at you sideways if they are suspicious of you. And in today's world, that's enough to generate a lawsuit sometimes. So we just think that the dogs create more complications than they solve problems. So usually leave them at home. So our dogs are out with livestock on home pastures and during the times of year, during lambing and kidding especially, and other times of the year when we're just staying put.
Mhm. And you have border collies that you use as well?
So I have a Kelpie, and I also have a border collie pup in the kennel right now, and that is a challenge. Learning that is really difficult to get a working herding dog up to the level that you can trust them with your stock. It's not to say that mine are untrustworthy. It's just a different type of training than I've ever experienced before with other dogs, and so I'm learning every day. I'm excited about this puppy. I think she's got a lot of potential, and we spent the first decade basically with sheep and goats, moving them with electric fencing from one adjacent paddock to the next adjacent paddock, so we really didn't have that much need for herding dogs, or at least we didn't know what we were missing. So we just kept working. And now we've just gotten to a number and in large enough properties that the dogs would be really helpful. And I would say the herding dogs I've had so far are better than no dog, but not by a lot. they, you know, they're helping. They probably save me some labor, but they're not quite. I'm hoping this puppy will turn out to be the kind of dog you can just send 800 yards away to gather things up and bring them back to you.
Yeah, yeah. It, for me, boy, once you have a good working dog, it's just hard to do without. And even if we're not out grazing, even just in the barn, moving them from pen to pen, running them through the chute to work, whatever, it's just so much easier with a dog. But certainly having a good dog, especially if it's pretty easy to get a dog that'll help in confinement or in around the barn, pushing through the chute, that sort of thing. If you have a dog where you're gathering a large field and you can just send him out there to do his thing, that's so amazing. I couldn't do without my dogs.
It's hard to beat, for sure.
Yeah, it
Yeah.
is.
We had a
Well,
Go ahead,
sorry,
Aaron.
go ahead. That's where I hope I'm headed. Right now, my Kelpie, she's pretty good in the yard. She's pretty good, in the pens. And so I was maybe too hard on her earlier, but she's useful, but not quite what I'm looking for yet. And I'm hoping to find it soon. Yeah.
Yeah, very good. Hey, well, Aaron, it was very nice chatting with you. Do you have any plugs you want to put in for folks for anything before we close this out?
Yeah. Thanks for the opportunity.
Tell people where they can find you.
Yeah, goatsonthego.com is the best place to find us and all the information about what we do and about our affiliate program. We're also on all the social media channels at Goats on the Go. Farmdogpodcast.com, or just search Farm Dog on any podcast app you like, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, whatever, and you'll find us, and we'd appreciate a listen.
All right, very good.
Sounds
Hey,
good.
thanks again for coming on and telling us about Goats on the Go and Farm Dog Podcast.
It's my pleasure, guys. Thanks so much.
It was good, interesting talking to you, and I'm sure we'll be in contact more in the future. So good seeing
I'd love
you.
that.
Yeah.
Excellent. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Once again, this is the Profitable Sheep and Goat Production Podcast, where it's more than just our hobby, it's our bread and butter. Thanks for listening, folks. Come back and join us as we converse with farmers and ranchers who are leaders in the industry, interview nutritionalists and veterinarians that can answer questions and offer valuable information. Got that sheep or goat question you'd like answers to, or something you'd like to hear discussion on? Give us a call at 717-310-3641. Select the option for Sheep and Goat Podcast questions and leave a detailed message. Or send me an email at leon@lostcreekwholesale.net. Thanks, and see you next time. Universal Feeders, feeding your livestock one lick at a time.